I'm Spartacus Olsson.
I'm Anna Deinhard.
And I'm Indy Neidell, as played by Leather Tuscadero. And this is another exciting Time Ghost Fireside chat. Now, we look suspiciously like we're wearing the same clothing as in the last Fireside chat because we're filming this just after the last one because we were being asked questions about the preparations for Barbarossa, and she had a bunch more questions.
Ooh, let me guess.
It's about Barbarossa.
No.
You nervous?
Totally.
I'm not. I enjoy being on camera.
Oh, Tuscadero.
Okay.
Leather Tuscadero was cool, man.
He was.
We get a picture of Susie Quattro as Leather Tuscadero. Thank you. Start the questions.
Okay, the invasion begins.
The invasion begins. Okay.
Yes. Were Germany's initial successes more the product of German skill or Soviet failure?
Well, it is a combination of both. You could say that about most successful invasions, but, well, more or less to agree. The German experienced spectacular initial success, but already in those successes, you could see the seeds of failure. By that, I mean, this is the real Bewegungskrieg, mobile war, because they can't fight a set-piece war against the Soviets. They don't have the men, and you have to have tactics. So they would, race ahead, create these cauldrons, and capture literally 200, 300,000 guys in one fell swoop. But the Soviets eventually weren't going to sit around and let that happen. And even as after the first few weeks, they began pulling back. They began not leaving their men in places where they could plow forward. And the Germans began having mechanical failures because they could not use the Soviet railways since they're different gauge anyway. But the Soviets were destroying everything in their path as they pulled back. So the Soviets had to build their own railway system, which became more and more important because when the ground gets churned up and when it rains, and once you get to September and you get the Rasputitsa begins and stuff, then you can't do this war of movement, and then you eventually become forced into a set piece war. It's spectacular when it works, but it is your downfall when it doesn't.
On a personal note, Anna, do you know that your grandfather was actually, he's an architect in the Wehrmacht engineer corps, and his job was specifically that, building railways or managing the building of railways. Yeah, they had to lay down new rail, and that's what Herbert did.
The German trains couldn't run on Soviet railways anyway, and they couldn't use the Soviet gasoline, for their tanks. In France, because they used the tanks could pull over at a gas station in the Battle of France and fill up at a local French gas station. Can't do that in Russia. Completely different octane, completely different. Yeah. So, as for Soviet failures, to an extent, the Germans were correct about what had happened to the Red Army over through the purges, when they lost whatever 25, 30% of their officer class. You saw how poorly they fought in the Winter War in Finland. I mean, the Soviet Union lost 500,000 men and took 4 months to not take Finland, but to make a deal where, they took a bunch of land in Finland. In that same time period, later on, a few months later, the Germans took Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and fucking France as well, and did a pretty good number on the British Air Force and the British installations at the same time. So yeah, the Soviet limitations were myriad and were there for all to see, but they were not quite what the Germans expected, and they also were a lot more fixable than anybody thought. I mean, within the first couple hours, like over 1,000 Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground. That's a lot, but they can build more. They can build more tanks. They can pull their industry back. I mean, already in September and October, factories that had been in Ukraine were now over in the Ural Mountains and were operating. And these factories were like the size, 5 times the size of the biggest factory in Germany at the time.
I think one should, you kind of touched on it, but I think one should really put a focus on geography as well, because when the invasion begins, they're basically traveling across the Ukrainian plains This is already in the north where they hit the marshes and the marshlands.
Right.
It gets very difficult
Yep.
very quickly. And only a few weeks into the invasion, the Germans are now beyond Kiev, and they start really running into trouble because of it's a few weeks.
Yeah.
It's what, 8-9 weeks?
Okay.
Yeah,
Sure.
8-9 weeks. So they're running into the forested regions, the hillier regions, and now things start slowing down.
And you have
Everything
to build
starts
your own
getting
logistical chain.
which is now stretched as well.
In those initial days, as the Red Army seemed to crumble, was there any real prospect of the Soviet upper echelons removing Stalin? According to many sources, Stalin certainly feared it when he retreated to his dacha.
Did he not always fear that he was going to be killed?
Yeah, why do you think he did the purges of the army and the Ukrainian famine? You got to
He was
wipe out Ukrainian
constantly-
nationalism. You got to wipe out anyone who might possibly be a threat. Yeah, it was any remnants of the middle class and local nationalism in the early 1930s. The only possible threat to his situation by the mid and late 30s was the army, and the purges destroyed that.
Which
The fear
answers
doing
the
that.
question. The answer is no.
No, he was
because
not. He was.
he-
There was. Stalin was no. He was not. No, he was not going to be overthrown. You know, Golikov, who ran intelligence, who fed Stalin rosy pictures that everything was okay, and sure, he got all the rumors that the Soviets, had a few million men just across the border ready to attack. And everybody kind of knew it, and the British were telling them, and the Americans were telling them that we've got intelligence that the Soviets are going to attack.
Richard Sorge was telling
But
me.
we got to realize, you got to think, oh, Richard Sorge, yeah, of course. And you got to realize, let's say you're Golikov, and the last 6 guys who've had your position have all been executed for bringing news that above doesn't want to hear, and above is Stalin. So what are you going to tell him?
I
And
won't
are you
tell
going to try to overthrow him?
No.
So whatever Stalin himself believed, there was no plausible or realistic risk that he was going to be overthrown at this point.
No, it's absolutely, even in those first few months, no, not at all.
Okay, continuing. Did the Germans really invade the Soviet Union without winter coats?
Yes.
Yes.
That would have been bad for morale, issuing winter uniforms in June and July. Remember, they're saying they beat France in 6 weeks. Come on, how long? The French army, way better than the Soviet army. How long is this going to take? Issuing winter uniforms, that's telling to the soldiers, wait. We're going to be here in the Soviet Union when it gets cold. Doesn't it get cold in the Soviet Union? I've heard it gets cold in the Soviet Union. Yeah.
And they were actually fully convinced that by the latest mid-November, they would have defeated the Red Army. That was
Yeah.
the...
It was
that
just them. So the Western allies were like, well, easy come, easy go. The Atlantic Charter was written later on with the premise that the Soviet Union was going to fall.
Everybody was totally convinced. So the real failure was not sending them to the Soviet Union without winter coats in June. That's sort of normal. The real failure was not providing them once the winter came. But there were much worse things than that. They also had not, for instance, tested the viscosity of oil that they were using to
Yeah.
lubricate their tanks. They were virtually unprepared for a winter war. They had no idea. So the oil that they were using to lubricate their tanks and also to lubricate, the motors, everything on a tank needs lubrication. It actually froze at I think -16, -17, which already in November was...
October was already snowing.
Yeah. And in October, they were hitting -20, in some cases, even going down to -30 in the northern parts. It was a cold winter. It was
I know what
colder
I was
than
going to say
expected.
to that other question. I was going to say, the Hitler and the German High Command never saw Princess Bride, because Wallace Shawn is absolutely right about that, saying, you made one of the classic blunders. The first, of course, is never wage a land war in Asia. And the Japanese have been learning this since 1937. So, and I think the Germans learned that too, because the Soviets have those two incredible advantages: seemingly endless men and actually endless territory.
Yes. So I mean, and that comes down to, again, failure or success, wisdom, and everything that you asked in the first question. And it's pertinent to the winter issue as well. Russia is so big, it's so huge, right, that you can keep on moving away from an army and just let them starve themselves to death.
Because you're doing scorched earth, obviously. That's the thing.
And if you go back only a few years before this, you see how important it is to employ that strategy when you look at the Russian Civil War, where both the whites and the reds, more than anything, more than actually fighting each other on the battlefield, they're trying to outmaneuver each other in order to make sure that the other one gets pushed into a situation where they can't retreat.
Yeah.
And it fails for the whites and succeeds for the reds. Well, it's another story, but it's
Nestor and the blacks, Nestor Machno.
Yeah, well, Nestor Machno doesn't fail there though.
Yeah, but I like that. I just wanted to mention his name.
Yeah, cool guy.
Yeah,
horrible guy, but kind of cool.
Yeah, but cool figure, cool historical figure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Germany's Axis allies also committed atrocities against Jews in the occupied Soviet Union. So too did collaborationist militias and civilians, example given pogroms in Ukraine and Baltic states. How much of this was down to latent anti-Semitism and how much was down to the influence of Germany?
War against humanity.
Okay, I think I have to explain something here. And we talked about this in the previous episode. So the preparation now is that they are going to round up Jewish Soviet citizens and they are going to start shooting them en masse. That's the idea from the beginning, modeled on what they did in Poland in 1939 with the intelligentsia. They also plan to start moving the Polish Jewish population that they rounded up and now put in ghettos to put them into the same system. They know that this is going to potentially lead to a backlash and resistance by the population, even the non-Jewish population. So they actually deliberately plan to seize this latent anti-Semitism and to move the anti-Semites of the Ukrainian Republic, Lithuania, those are the first two they're going to counter, and also Eastern Poland, to help them out in this cause. And it is really two pogroms that are not carried out by the Germans, but supported by the Germans.
Yeah, we talked. I remember seeing this even in the regular episodes.
Yes, exactly.
That's horrible.
There's two specific pogroms which launches the Holocaust, first the Holocaust by bullets, and that is the pogrom in Lviv, now Lviv, then Lvov, and the one in Vilnius coming before the one in Lviv. Those two pogroms are the first ones. And what it shows the Germans is that there is not going to be huge resistance against a rounding up of the Jews and a mass murder of the Jews. So
they
now,
were a bit mistaken at that at times, but
but
less
not
than they
here.
thought. Yeah, not here at all.
No, not here. So they basically, that's what launches it. And when they start then more or less directly, this happens in July, and by September, they're actually running the killing pits where they're then rounding up sometimes tens of thousands of men, women, and children and shooting them with machine guns. By that time, they've solidified this into an actual system where local volunteers are the ones doing a lot of the dirty work, especially the digging of pits and those parts, but also even taking part in the shooting and rounding up Jewish citizens. You can't answer the question with an either or. It's a combination of the two things. The German Nazis are very well aware of that there is a willingness to participate in this kind of thing, and the willingness to participate in this kind of thing is also a premise for doing it in the first place. This, of course, reaches absolutely horrific proportions. The worst one being in Babi Yar, where 31,500 people are killed in only a matter of hours. Well, over 2 days, most of them in 1 day, and most of them women and children, because many of the men were Red Army soldiers and had been forced to leave with the retreating Red Army as this happened. And that left the elderly, not able-bodied men, women, mothers, children, teenagers. And these are the ones that were murdered in that way. And the perpetrators were not only German. There's another part of it which is also significant, and that there you see how not latent, but rampant anti-Semitism plays into it. And that is how the Romanians cooperated by actually more or less purging all the Jewish population that lived in the eastern part of Romania and moving them into Transnistria, where some of the most horrific acts happened during this period. And they actually were so horrific that even the German Einsatzgruppen complained and said, "No, you're being too extensive," which is absurd because there is nothing more horrible than what the Einsatzgruppen were doing. But then you can figure. I'm not going to get into it now. If you want to know more of the details,
what about the Einsatzgruppen and the army? How that worked? What the relations between them, the actual Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppen, who were following them, and everybody's got the orders and stuff.
It was a perfectly cordial relationship. The Wehrmacht cooperated in rounding up dissidents, communists and Jewish people. They helped with logistics. They helped with providing arms. The Wehrmacht even lent personnel. It was on a voluntary basis. You were never forced to do these things. You had to be volunteer to do it. But there were many Wehrmacht soldiers that were seconded to the Einsatzgruppen to work for them and with them. And more than anything, they secured the Einsatzgruppen's back. And this quickly also was expanded because obviously there was resistance. You might ask more about that later on, but there was resistance. And once the resistance actually started happening, the programs were extended to other people than the Jewish and the communist Soviet citizens. So it's an effort that was impossible to do without cooperation by the local people.
And that's something that has to be emphasized, that it would have been impossible to do without cooperation.
Yes.
It wouldn't have been more difficult to do. It would have been impossible to do.
Absolutely. They would have, there is a possibility, kill everyone.
That
is logistically then impossible. But this is the point. It really is one of those cases of when nobody stands up for what is right, well, then what is wrong will prevail.
Hey, sidetrack. I think we mentioned once several years ago when you said, "Oh, the other option is to kill everybody," and that reminds me of the massacre of Merv. Remember we talked about I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Merv, M-E-R-V. Merv was the largest city in the world 800 years ago. You think of the biggest cities in the world through history, you think, well, Rome, that was, that was pretty big, and Constantinople. Right? Have you guys ever heard of Merv? Well, there's still a small settlement there, but Merv, they made the minor tactical blunder of when the Mongols were sweeping through the Middle East. The Mongol envoy came and said, "By the way, you have to surrender your city or else we're going to..." They killed the envoy. They didn't just say no or say, "Oh, yes, we submit," and stuff. So I think the number was 268, but it's 200 and something. Every one of the Mongol troops, the soldiers that went into Merv when they sacked Merv, because they estimated the population. Apparently, it was like 1 million people lived in Merv. Each soldier had to kill that many people. It didn't matter if they were babies, normal 25-year-old men, women, old people. You were responsible specifically for that many people to depopulate the entire city of Merv. And they depopulated the entire city of Merv. They did do the let's kill everybody thing, which paid great dividends because people, didn't kill Mongol envoys after that, And people said, okay, because the Mongols, when they took over your city, they didn't like cities and they didn't particularly like religion, but they kept hands off on religion because they didn't give a shit about that. They just wanted the money and stuff, and they would depopulate or spread out cities and stuff through the Middle East. But they weren't doing like Hitler. They were doing worse because they didn't actually care that you were Jewish or whatever.
But this really comes down to, and Merv is really a relevant example here because Merv is a city and you have everybody inside of a city, which is one of the reasons why in 1939 and 1940 the Nazis are moving the Jewish population of Poland together, and Czechoslovakia and other places, moving them together into ghettos in order to make it possible for them to actually kill all of these people at once. Once you get to a territory as large as the Ukrainian Republic, Belarus, and the Baltic states, this becomes a virtual impossibility because...
Especially like Ukraine,
and on top of it, you're also fighting the Red Army at the same time. So you would have to you would have to put more people towards the genocide than you do to the actual war. And this might sound like I'm speculating or something like that, but we're not there yet in what you're asking about so far. But eventually, this logistical problem, as terrible as it sounds, it is a logistical problem, horrific. This logistical problem is what's going to lead to the final solution. So,
instead of the Holocaust by bullets.
Yes. So.
And why were the Jews in the West initially spared the worst of the violence meted out upon the Jews of the East?
Well, we touched upon this in the last episode, and the simple answer is that they were aware that they were going to meet resistance, larger resistance there than they would in the East, and not because the Western population was less anti-Semitic. I don't know what less or more anti-Semitic is.
You go back to the Dreyfus affair and you can take it as...
Well, I mean, less or more, that's not the point here. The point is how organized is society still. In the West, the German occupation has now been established. They are trying to milk this land for
again,
resources.
like 30% of the German war effort is paid for by stuff
They need
from
to
France.
have those resources, and they know that even if it will not make great resistance, it will meet some resistance. So they hold off on that for now. And in the East, on the other hand, is full-out war. We talked about Generalplan Ost, or the Hunger Plan, where they at least intended to kill a large portion of the Slavic population as well, as they go into this by starving them to death. This actually fails during that period, and it fails for a very simple reason, or some very simple reasons. One, the Red Army scorches the earth as they retreat, so there's like no real way for the Germans to worsen the situation. Whatever they can get, they take, and well, the population doesn't get much. But there's a much more important issue, and that is that a lot of the population disappears because the population retreats with the Red Army. So we have a situation where some people who sympathize with the Germans, actually, because we should not forget that there is a large anti-Soviet part of the population here in the western parts of the Soviet Union. So some people stay behind thinking, erroneously, that they are going to be treated well by the Germans, treated better by the Nazis than they were by the Bolsheviks. But they are not, of course. They are treated horribly as well. So at this point, the whole Generalplan Ost fails, but they implement it on the Red Army soldiers that they have captured as POW. So I think, if I remember correctly now, it's 3 million die before April 42, if I remember correctly. It's an enormous amount. They basically just put them in open camps with no food, no resources, nothing, and just let them starve to death.
Hey, one thing though, about the successes of Germans or the failures of Russians. One thing that, despite all the successes of the Germans, which I might as well mention it here because who knows when we're going to mention it, within the first 4 months of Barbarossa, for all the staggering success, taking Kiev and taking the cauldrons, taking hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of prisoners, killing Russians in the millions, just starting all this, by October, by Operation Typhoon, which was the drive on Moscow, by the time of that, the Germans have already taken 680,000 casualties. They've inflicted a lot more, but that's also the seeds of defeat are also there in victory. Because even in victory, you're still losing a hell of a lot of guys, even though you're winning spectacularly.
And equipment.
And equipment. And horses.
Can you talk about the partisan war behind the lines? What did this look like in...
This is a you episode.
A little bit, yeah.
What did this look like in 1941 to early 1942? Were civilians and bypassed Red Army soldiers already contributing to the war? In France, we don't see a huge growth in the resistance until the prospect of an Allied landing becomes imminent. So where do we stand in the dark days of Barbarossa? Where are people placed between collaboration, resignation, and resistance stand?
Well, okay, so this is actually a fairly simple question to answer. In difference to the invasion of France, the lowlands, and Scandinavia, we've already established this. They're fighting a genocidal war, and they start from the very get-go killing people en masse.
Even in Poland, they're strafing civilians the first day. Stukas are doing that September 1st. 1939.
So, and the resistance in Poland is huge. This is in Poland. the underground, the Armia Krajowa, the underground army is the largest resistance movement of the war at this point.
Yeah.
Tito will surpass that with his partisan, but at this point, Armia Krajowa is the biggest resistance movement. They are very much matched very quickly by the Soviet partisans, by the resistance. And Stalin, and well, not just Stalin, but the whole Vasilevsky and all of them understand this. I think Vasilevsky becomes chief of that operation at this point, way before he rises into the marshal level. They understand that this provides them with a real opportunity. So for already in July, when the invasion has just started, the Red Army starts organizing the partisans as part of the Red Army effort. So you have three kinds of civilians, basically, that come out of this. You have the ones who stay behind to collaborate, many of whom are disappointed by the idea of collaboration. Then you have the ones who stay behind for reasons that are just unfortunate, like the ones stuck in Leningrad, for instance.
Like the 300 or 400 civilians who never evacuated Stalingrad, even during the battle. We stayed there going about their daily lives. Like, no, we're not leaving. They weren't they weren't fighting. They're just there.
So you got that kind of people. Unfortunately, a large part of them are the Jewish population who, for reasons of not wanting to support the war, not wanting to be part of it, and stuff like that, stay behind, which spells their death. And then you have the third kind of civilians, which are the ones who retreat with the Red Army. There really isn't any other state of being in the Soviet Union at this point. You are either a collaborator, a victim, or you're a part of the war effort. And being part of the war effort can mean, in this case, that you are left behind. Because like Indy pointed out earlier, the advance of the German army is incredibly fast. And they overrun so much territory. But what a large portion of the civilian population do, and not a majority part or anything like that, but it's a significant part, especially young people, they go into the forest and say, okay,
particularly in the center and stuff, in like the 43.
I want to live to fight another day, and they start organizing themselves into the resistance there. This also leads to some terrible atrocities by people like Vasilevsky, who are
they set out these whole missions to destroy particular partisan groups where they'll kill 10,000 guys.
And kill anyone. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a baby or just everyone, in order to stop it all, which they fail to do. So it's a very, very different situation. It's not the same premise, and the willingness to organize resistance is much greater from the Soviet Union.
But you don't have quite the same existential threat, so that's what leads to it. Really.
Yeah, because it's the existential threat that enables all of this. Because, like I said, even the ones who welcomed the Germans as some kind of liberators from communism
they are sadly disappointed.
Yes, terribly disappointed.
Okay.
So
moving to kind of a different topic, tanks, planes, guns, etc. during Barbarossa.
Okay. Sure.
Why was the T-34 such a shock to the Germans? Shouldn't they have had some idea of what they were facing? Did they simply just consider the Soviets incapable of producing such a vehicle?
Yes.
Okay, fair.
No, I mean, it wasn't just the T-34. It was also the KVs. When they saw the KVs, the heavy tanks, Germans didn't have heavy tanks like that. What the hell is this? Nobody told it. Especially, you get tank panic. You saw it from the Great War and stuff. Yeah, you got tank panic among the Germans. The T-34s were great all-weather tanks. I'm never wanting to say, when people go, which is the best tank? It depends on the situation and what if you send the KVs out in the Sahara Desert, they're the worst tank, right? Depends, things are better or worse when they're
it's made for,
out
right?
there. But T-34 is a good machine. I mean, we see them in Korea and stuff too. T-34 is a solid machine. No, they weren't expecting the kind of numbers of them anyway. Anybody that may have known or saw on the first day, hey, those guys had a big ass tank. I didn't know yet. And it describes it, and the other guys, okay, we know they've got that tank. They don't expect 500 of them to come, right?
Okay. And the Soviet Air Force, what on earth is happening? Was it pretty much destroyed on the ground at the start of the war?
Yes.
Okay, also fair.
Yep, but these are easy questions. Yes, and yes. But the Soviets were able to very quickly build a new Air Force.
Because they had moved all the industry.
The Soviets, I mean, they lost, I mean, literally in the first couple hours, they lost over 1,000 planes on the ground.
Wow.
Right? You know, with the surprise and everything. And they had 10,000 planes, but they had older planes. They had planes that couldn't keep up. They had planes that didn't work. Yeah, but they could build a new Air Force really quickly.
Let me ask you this. And it's not as a question. I'm not being rhetorical at all.
Okay.
Did this actually help the Soviets because they needed to modernize their air fleet?
Oh, absolutely. I've never actually thought about that before, but as soon as you start the question, I'm like, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
It did, didn't it?
That was it did. I mean, you know, and what they did with the old planes, then they gave them to the night witches.
They did.
Yeah. And oh boy,
Which is
the Nachthexen. You know, the Germans did not like those ladies. I love the night. Who doesn't love the night witches?
Isn't it? Like give them the old planes.
Yeah, and see what they could do with them too. You know,
Those girls were badass.
they were badass.
Yeah, and
night
it's
witches.
such a badass name.
The Night Witches. By the way, at the end of this episode, we've got a link to Sabaton History episode about
We have
Night
one
Witches.
on World War II as well. Let's
Oh, we
link
do?
to both.
We'll link to both.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay, and how much difference did Land-Lease make at this early stage of the war?
Not much. Not by now. Not by now.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out what Indy said in the previous talk we had about the preparations for Barbarossa. And that's that there's a war going on in the Atlantic. And it looks pretty good for the Germans at the moment. It does not look so good for Great Britain. And Lend-Lease requires material coming from the United States of America, which is on the other side of the Atlantic. So it's really, really difficult. The other way is, of course, the Pacific, but that's a huge body of water. So getting any material.
And remember, the United States is not in an active state of war either. So there's not the urgency that there will be in 1942.
So, for our last question, the Germans severely underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, will to resist, and the resilience of the state. Was this entirely down to simple intelligence failure, or was it the blindness of racial hatred?
The latter.
No, it wasn't that. I mean, the world knew what the Soviet Red Army was like in general from the Winter War, which I've mentioned in the last episode. And even though they had obviously rebuilt and built up, and Stalin was selling Germany and giving Germany all it needed, so he had time to build up and stuff. No, everybody knew that the German army, pound for pound, was better than the Red Army. But it was beyond that. There was no question among a lot of German high command, particularly the ideological fervent part of the high command, that they were going to win because they were just better. And then you had guys that did the practical bits who weren't necessarily not racist themselves, like Jose Paulus, who'd be like, yeah, we might not like the Slavs and the Jews, but we're gonna lose. And so he did his duty.
I'll actually add some flavor to that and put it this way: if it wasn't for racial blind hatred, they would never have invaded the Soviet Union.
They would have actually listened to all of the predictions.
Writing was on the wall.
Everybody who did any model said we're going to lose. You're going to lose. Against this shitty Soviet army, how could we possibly going to lose? So they're going to lose.
It literally is. You said at some point, you might as well call an episode about Barbarossa. The moment.
What happens this week? This week in the war, Germany loses the war. That's the extra we did the June 22nd episode.
You have to be careful with that though, because there is, first of all. Well, it could have gone some other way. We don't know that. But it's unlikely.
Counterfactuals are counterfactuals.
We don't know that. But we should not forget what this war was about. This war was not only about beating the Red Army or winning a military war. This was a genocidal war aimed primarily at the Jewish people of Europe, but also of what was perceived as the inferior races like the Slavs and of political dissidents. That was the main driving force behind the war. And
remember, Hitler thought the British were going to join him. Come to the negotiating table.
Because how could they not? Because they are also victims of this cabal, right? And so, you have to see it from that vantage point. And if you enter into that logical or illogical world, and you accept the premises that they have set up for themselves, that there is a racial war for dominance of the world, that there is a conspiracy to destroy Germany and all of that. Well, then this becomes a war of existential necessity. And that's exactly how they set it up. So now we've exited from specifically the rational logic. There was never anything rational about war, but the rational logic that might drive you to think, okay, it might be a geopolitical advantage if I take Ukraine away from the Russians. That's got nothing to do with it anymore, because suddenly we're talking about a visceral fear of being destroyed, which is paranoid delusion at the highest level, but that's what they believed.
And that's very interesting that you just said just that about the geopolitical advantage stuff, because some of the early conquests were in the name of geopolitical advantage, like, you know, taking Yugoslavia.
Yeah, sure.
They had no plan. They weren't plan. They certainly weren't planning on attacking Greece. But once the Italians failed there, and the British are there, the British can bomb the place, the oil fields and stuff. Or Norway, you know, when King Haakon of Norway got woken up at the beginning of April when Norway was invaded, and they said, "We're being invaded, sir." And he said, "By whom?" Because both the British and Germans had plans to invade Norway.
And that was geopolitical.
That was geopolitical. That wasn't an existential crisis. That's why they didn't kill 20% of the Norwegian population or 30% of the Norwegian population.
But now we're talking about what is perceived by these paranoid delusional monsters, and you can't put it any other way. I'm sorry, but I have to put it that way. I don't like using that kind of adjective because it's kind of clear by what they do. And you once said, if you tell what the Nazis did and failed for people, and people fail to see that they were monsters,
if you don't have to say they're bad guys.
You don't have to say it. But in
you
this
say
case,
they're bad, you don't have to say it.
But in order to make it understandable, that is what it is. It's a monstrous idea that without killing all the other people, our people will die.
Yeah.
This is the idea that lies behind it. And therefore, at this point, and that's what's so dangerous about these kind of ideas, at this point, any rational thought of, well, we might lose are out the window. It doesn't matter because, well, if we lose, then we're dead anyway. So it's suicide either way. That's what they saw it as. And maybe we have a chance. If we take the Soviets, maybe we have a chance.
As you can see, probably, well, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes.
It does.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Except
Okay, and with that, and let's have something uplifting. One more picture of Suzi Quatro. Thank you. And with that, we'll end this another exciting fireside chat. We still haven't actually talked much about Barbarossa, about an Operation Typhoon, or I guess things like that. So I'm assuming at some point, I don't know if it's gonna be today or not. Okay, well we'll see. We'll see what Anna and Clara have for us, because they do the production for these. We just do the answering. Usually
and James, he prepares the questions. Yeah.
Oh, James. Oh yeah, of course. Picture of James. Picture of James and Suzi Quatro.
making
What a
out.
couple!
Oh my gosh. Now don't make them making out. Picture of James and Suzi Quatro. Oh gosh. And by the way, make it in a downloadable format for us, because I'm definitely gonna print that out and frame it and put it on my wall. Picture of James Newman and Suzi Quatro. That's awesome. Right?
It would be.
Okay. Join the Time Ghost Army. You know the drill. TimeGhost.tv, patreon.com. It'll make us happy. We can make more of these. We can cover more wars. We have plans for 10-year projects. We enjoy making history for you. We obviously enjoy talking about it. And if you're still watching, then you obviously enjoy watching it. Okay, well, guys, that's it for today. Excelsior! Time Ghost presents Suzi Quatro. Suzi Quatro's great quote was, "You're never wrong when you're wearing black leather."
Suzi Quatro.
Suzi, come on, Suzi Quatro was... Who didn't love Suzi Quatro in the 70s? Yeah, Suzi Quatro was really cool. And remember there was an episode when her and Ralph Malph were like almost romantically linked.
Yeah.
That was Ralph's high point in all of Happy Days. So, Suzi Quatro.
Yeah, he went from mistakable nerd to
the
coolest guy on the block.
Anybody,
than Fonzie.
if you have a date with Suzi Quatro, whether or not she's Suzi Quatro or Leather Tuscadero, you're by definition the coolest guy on the planet. That's just what it is. Clara doesn't understand what we're talking about. It's okay.
I don't too.
I'll show you some videos later. She's really cool.
We definitely need a Happy Days fireside chat.
Yeah, we need a Happy Days fireside chat.